Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm Sally Satel. I'm a resident scholar here. And I'm also a former mentee of Dr. Peter Kramer. I met him in 1982 at the Brown University School of Medicine. And I was assigned to him for supervision, and he hasn't stopped supervising. And I'm very grateful for it. So I'm going to give a slightly longer introduction than usual. Before I introduce the participants today, I want to take a moment to bring two things into perspective for folks. Prozac itself, and then the book, Listening to Prozac. Today, Prozac is kind of prosaic. It's with an S, not a Z. But it was a huge big deal 35 years ago. It was approved by the FDA in December of 1986, and it was almost immediately attractive to psychiatrists because the side effect profile was significantly less than two other classes of medications which were developed in the 50s and used with some frequency, but not nearly as much as Prozac came to be used. And those were called tricyclic antidepressants, Elavil, that's the one most people have heard of, and then these drugs called monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which were tricky because you couldn't eat certain things with them. And they both worked, but as I say, they did have side effects. So Prozac was just so appreciated for the fact that it had a fairly low side effect profile. And it just took off. Within a few months, there were 650,000 prescriptions per month written. And by 1992, 8 million people were on SSRI, SSRI, which means selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. That was the class of medication that Prozac belonged to. I mean, it was truly a blockbuster drug for Eli Lilly. By 1990, it was on the cover of Newsweek. You may recall Tony Soprano was the, at first, reluctant recipient of Prozac. So at that time, though, psychiatry was in a kind of a transition period. This was the 1970s. Prozac was, as I said, approved in 1987, but Peter was trained in the 70s in medical school, and that was the beginning, really, of the era of what we call biological psychiatry. And it was displacing the Freudian worldview, which saw psychiatric symptoms not so much as attached to specific mental diseases, but rather as arising from unconscious conflicts and for which insight through psychoanalysis or psychodynamic psychotherapy was considered the cure. The latter was, but that was falling away. And in the 70s, medication for depression, as I said, which was considered mainly a neuroses, actually, were in use. I mentioned those two medications before, but they came with unpleasant side effects. So this is one change that's happening. We're moving more from an analytic enterprise to more of a biological one. Of course, they can coexist, and now I think they do to a large extent. But in terms of paradigm shifts, that's what was going on around the time. And another dynamic that was happening was that memoirs of depression were kind of being written, most notably the one by William Styron called Darkness Visible. And this was eroding the taboo about talking about one's own mental health. And these were big deals. So when Prozac, its fancy name being fluoxetine hydrochloride, came along, in this era when medications were having a more role to play, and when people were talking more about depression. I mean, it really was, your timing was brilliant. So when Peter started prescribing Prozac in soon 1988, because it was approved in December of 1987, he started to see a transformation in many, and not all of them, maybe 20%, but it was really an incredible transformation. It wasn't just a reduction in the symptoms of depression, the low energy and the sorrowful mood and the self-recriminations and the suppressed appetite and all that, but also changes in temperament. Some people went from being indecisive to assertive. from self-effacing to confident, from obsessional to more contemplative, people who ruminated over their flaws or over the state of the world became somewhat more complacent. This really changed people's lives. They took challenges that they would never have taken before. They changed their circumstances. And most importantly, they thought differently about themselves. And that's really what inspired the word and the title, Listening to Prozac. That's what really inspired it, that they were listening, they were thinking differently about themselves. They were almost listening to the changes that this drug inspired in them. And then Peter was listening to them, listening to themselves. But it also raised a fascinating profound questions about identity and the extent to which our characteristics and our characters have biological underpinnings. And then it raised the question of, well, what if people who were otherwise healthy, who weren't depressed, were given these medications, and it changed their personalities? People are not unrecognizable, but, in significant ways, changed aspects of their temperament. What about that? So, as Peter writes in his new introduction, and it is even if you have the book, definitely take this because this is a 50-page introduction, that his book at the time was, quote, built on worries over the challenges that SSRIs posed for medical ethics and our understanding of personhood. So it's a little hard to get more profound than that. The book was greeted with rapturous reviews, but my favorite one was from the American Journal of Psychiatry. I forgot who wrote it, but it said, Kramer presents a lucid and convincing case that American psychiatry is not brain dead. It became a national bestseller, an international bestseller. It sparked all kinds of listening memes, listening to, Oprah Nightline, The Today Show, was assigned in courses on medical ethics and psychopharmacology and psychiatry, was the biggest seller since Freud, and the first psychiatry book that engaged an entire public conversation. But even bigger, the ultimate indicator of its reach, its crowning mark on the public imagination, were the cartoons. So I just want to show you a few of them. Somehow I think I'm going to not get this right. I should have rehearsed this. Hello, can you get me the first slide? Thank you. Okay, great. I'm sure you can see it. So that's a happy child. I'll just read it. Of course, your daddy loves you, but he's on Prozac, so he loves everyone. The next one, there are 4. Since taking Prozac, I only chased parked cars. I love that. That was, again, the aspect of the transformation where people are just calmer, maybe a little less aggressive. Although on the other hand, some people became more assertive. Another one, since I've started taking my Viagra with my Prozac, I've been having great sex, but I don't care. And finally, this one, could we up the dosage? I'm still having feelings. Okay, so that's where we were in 1993, and we are all assembled here to discuss where we are now in terms of depression treatment, the field of psychiatry, and culture. So now for the formal part of your introduction, Peter Kramer, and these are truncated. I could talk for the whole time about these folks. Peter's practiced psychiatry and taught psychotherapy in Providence, Rhode Island for almost 40 years, and he now writes full-time, which is harder than work, and is an emeritus professor of psychiatry and human behavior at Brown University. He's written 8 books. His most recent one is a novel, and I think that's what you're going to continue to write, it sounds like, from what you told me, Peter, novels from here on. And that's a fascinating novel called The Death of the Great Man, in which a psychiatrist treats a Trump-like patient. He's also written an intellectual biography of Freud. In 2016, he wrote Ordinarily Well, The Case for Antidepressants, which, as the name implies, it's really a tour de force of the scientific literature, but very readable on antidepressants and makes the case for their importance. even though, as you know, there's been skepticism, public skepticism for quite a while. As Scott Stossel, who's down there, wrote in his New York Times review of Peter's book, Ordinarily Well, quote, he presents a case for the superiority of clinical wisdom over statistical analysis. Kramer evinces such humility that no one could accuse him of being a pro-medication ideologue. And in fact, humility and compassion are the two words that come up in all the commentary about about his work. So I invited Daphne Merkin and Scott Stossel to comment on Peter's book 30 years later, because they are both brilliant writers and they are brilliant sufferers. Daphne of depression and Scott on anxiety. And through those prisms, I know they would have enormously insightful things to say. Daphne Merkin is a literary critic, essayist, and novel. She's a former staff writer for The New Yorker. Her recent stunning memoir on depression, excuse me, is called This Close to Happy. She's written so many moving essays on the condition. She's written 2 novels, and her collection of essays are wide-ranging meditations on topics from family to religion to the psychological impact of money and, of course, sex, and a quest to make her therapist laugh. One of your admirers said, you are comfortable mixing Wittgenstein and Groucho Marx, and that is so true. She's profiled Taylor Smith, Madonna, and Kim Kardashian, and her work really runs from the profound to the profoundly entertaining. She's taught at the 92nd Street Y and other writing programs. Scott Stossel is the national editor of The Atlantic magazine. He's written 2 books. The first is Sarge, The Life and Times of Sergeant Shriver, which was award-winning biography. And his second book, which I reviewed and love, was called, and a New York Times bestseller, My Age of Anxiety, Fear, Hope, Dread, and the Search for Peace of Mind. It was shortlisted for the 2015 Wellcome Book Prize and was awarded the Eric Erikson Institute Prize for Excellence in Mental Health Media. His book is just outstanding. I just can't say enough wonderful things about it. It's a gripping memoir. It's kind of 3 things at once. And very funny in parts. It's meticulously researched clinical and psychopharmacological history of anxiety and a very astute cultural analysis. And I'll close by saying, Peter, one of the comments you made in listening to Prozac, can't remember now if it's the new introduction or the original, but that anxiety is the heart of the psychological understanding of man. It's the route to self-discovery. So that may come up. Anyway, so what's going to happen here is now that I've introduced you, Peter, you can come up here or sit where you are and give a few words on the book, this 30-year anniversary, and then you will sit down or continue to stay there. And I will ask you an incisive question, and I'll start you off with a penetrating question, and then I will have a light touch from here on, and Daphne and Scott will take it away after that. So, thank you all.
I think I will stand up on the grounds of maybe thinking better. And also because I always worry I'm not being heard or clear. I think as I get older, I start thinking aloud on microphone and mumbling, as I do. I want to start by expressing gratitude of different sorts. Some of the gratitude, and I'll leave this topic immediately, has to do with the current novel, Death of the Great Man. When I circulated the typescript, people were a little afraid of it. It has a murder mystery form slightly, and begins with a buffoonish autocrat dead on a psychiatrist's couch. And people were afraid to blurb it. They were afraid to endorse it because we're in times where people are afraid what Trump followers will do. And Daphne Merkin stood up right away and offered a very generous endorsement. And I don't know Daphne, though we've been on stages like this before, other than that acquaintance. And Sally did as well. And then when the book sort of languished, I think for similar reasons, it was sort of kryptonite, Scott stood up and did a feature piece, part interview in the New Yorker that's just very thoughtful and generous. And I'm grateful for that sort of attention and courage. And I'm grateful also to Sally for bringing me here to DC to look back on listening to Prozac. Someone who was going to be here today, unfortunately couldn't make it, is Walter Reich, who is still a practicing psychiatrist, but was in the Carter administration, later became head of the US Holocaust Museum. And I want to tell a little about how I came through Walter to come to Washington, because it gives a sense of what listening to Prozac was to me in its formation. And I say this also to sort of locate the book, locate the perspective of the book. And I'll say a little about how people take the book as opposed to how I took the book in its day. So I was in the 1970s, late 1970s, toward the end of my psychiatric residency at Yale. And I fell in love with Rachel, whom I later married, and we've been married for over 40 years. My supervisors were a little worried because I said to them that I was going to leave the residency and come to Washington, where Rachel was working, and finish out my residency at George Washington or Georgetown. And the person immediately ahead of me, my immediate boss, said that if I would do extra work for him for 6 months, and you have to imagine what that is like in a psychiatry residency. I did sort of time and a half in a psychiatry residency for 6 months. I could come to Washington and be supervised by Walter, who was on the Yale faculty, and finish out my concentration in community psychiatry in Washington. Walter was head of a program that disseminated cutting-edge ideas about community psychiatry to community psychiatry settings, to community mental health centers. So I did the extra work and came down to Washington, and by the time I arrived, that program had ended. So my interests in psychiatry were very largely psychotherapy and community psychiatry, public health psychiatry, basically bringing services to the underserved. And I was shunted in the government immediately to work under Jerry Clareman in what was called the Division of Science of the of ADAMHA, the Alcohol, Drug Abuse, and Mental Health Association, which oversaw NIMH and the other institutes. And my job, there was actually only one other professional there, who was Charlie Krauthammer. And I'm sure the American Enterprise Institute remembers Charles Krauthammer. But he had been a psychiatry resident under Jerry, and he left to become a speechwriter for Walter Mondale. He later became one of our premier conservative commentators, but he left that job. So I was left alone in the Division of Science. And my job was to master the federal portfolio in scientific research. So I knew all the studies from the NIMH and the Drug and Alcohol Institutes and the Veterans Association. And I had to translate the science for legislators and translate Jimmy Carter's policy for research administrators. So I was sort of an inadvertent scholar of cutting-edge scientific research, and I knew the researchers because we had the money, and the researchers came to us. So I got to know the biological, the brain researchers in psychiatry. That was, among other things, Jerry Clareman's main interest. So skip forward, as Sally has already done for us, and I should say, what a terrific framing introduction. Really give us a sense of what where these medications came from, what they meant. And I kept careful notes on my patients. I kept psychotherapy notes. I did mostly psychotherapy. And I had separate notes for medication, as doctors do. And I started noticing that my medication notes were looking a lot like my psychotherapy notes, that patients were attributing change to these medications that was like the kind of change that we aspire to in psychotherapy. And so I wrote a couple of articles for doctors. I was by then a regular columnist in a trade paper about this phenomenon, and that led to a book contract for listening to Prozac. So this, I felt in a way uniquely, maybe not uniquely, but particularly able to write this particular book. This was a book by someone who was very interested in psychotherapy, whose main focus was psychotherapy, who happened to know, sort of the entire scope of federally funded research, and who also knew the scientists and could draw on them. And I started writing people and saying I wanted to write this book, and this was pre-Google, pre-Alta Vista. People would send you boxes of their off-prints. So I'd get these big cardboard boxes with 60 papers by a given researcher and work my way through them. And I had a sense, I thought I had a sense of what I could say. So the articles that I'd written for colleagues were sort of the essence of listening to Prozac. They were saying, you're seeing what I'm seeing, that these medicines are having personality effects, temperament effects that go beyond just restoring a person to where he or she was before the episode of depression or the upsurge in obsessionality, whatever the medicine was given for. And in addition, the patients are attributing change to these medications in the way that they normally attribute it to psychotherapy, and believing that the medicines tell them something about themselves, that they perform a sort of dissection and tell them what about themselves is carefully developed personhood and what is biological happenstance, that what the medication changes presumably is biological happenstance. And as I said, some background in animal ethology, cell biology, all sorts of areas. And listening to Prozac is an attempt to make lots of different scientific disciplines shed light on this phenomenon that I observed. Parenthetically, this is why I went into psychiatry. I don't think I've pulled this off ever again, but I was a great admirer of Freud. The late Freud biography that I did recently is a little more skeptical, but I was a fairly unquestioning admirer of Freud, and I wanted to do what he did, which was to sit with patients and discover things about the mind, without all the apparatus of modern scientific research. And of course, I drew on the apparatus of modern scientific research indirectly. But this sort of was my dream, to have a clinical observation that would lead to people thinking differently about how we're constituted. So I think that's sort of the introduction. I will say one other thing, which is, Sally mentioned this new interest in autopathography, that William Styron had written an op-ed for the New York Times related to Primo Levi's suicide, and it was so controversial, so aroused so much interest that he turned it into this short book, Darkness Visible, which actually is largely skeptical about psychiatry, but increased readers' interest in psychiatry and made depression sort of known as an ailment and discussable. And when listening to Prozac came out, although it was about this very narrow issue, which is whether these medications had personality effects and why that's plausible, it was taken to be a book about depression. So that the book was enormously popular. I went from bookstore to bookstore. People would come up online and say they're very grateful for the book. It was so helpful to this or one or another relative of theirs. And the first time this happened, I said, well, I was confused. I said, I didn't mean for it to be helpful, which I understood immediately was rude and a mistake and cruel. But because you had to kind of explain what depression is and how we think about it psychologically and biologically, the book was taken to be in that tradition of expanding the discussion of depression. And I think a lot of the interest in it, some of it I hope was due to this new perspective I was introducing, but a lot of it just had to do with people wanting to read about depression altogether. And it's an extremely common ailment, And I think people saw themselves, and of course people would call me up and say they saw themselves in this or that vignette, and could they see me, or did I know someone in their city who did this kind of work? So I think it is a book that really has those two personalities, one sort of in the mainstream and in the cultural mainstream, thinking about depression and how we're going to talk and think about depression, and then this other one having to do with really taking a psychotherapist view of these new medications in regards to effects that they had and were not fully expected to have before they entered clinical practice. So why don't we stop there?
You know, I kept referring to listening to Prozac, but the subtitle is very informative as well. It's called Antidepressants and the Remaking of the Self. So my question is, you even asked this question in the introduction, do you think you could write this book today? How would it be different? Why or why not?
Yeah. So, you know, I wrote this new introduction and I had fun with it. I was very glad to be asked to do this, to look back over 30 years, 35 years of Prozac, 30 years of this book. And Jorge Luis Borges has a short story, Pierre Menard, author of The Quixote. And it is a fake review by a fake reviewer of a non-existent book. And the non-existent book is by Pierre Menard. And what Pierre Menard has done is he has written 2 chapters in 1918, 2 chapters of The Quixote. And Menard says how much more brilliant, Borges' narrator says, how much more brilliant Menard's Quixote is than Cervantes, because it was easy for Cervantes, one particular chapter is about military glory, easy to write about military glory when everybody believed in military glory. But in 1918, after the horrors of World War I, how much, how ironic, how ambiguous and, full of contradictory meaning it is to write these very same words. And I use that as a framework for this introduction because I think we have gotten inured to antidepressants. So many people are on them. So many people stay on them a long time. In particular, people who don't respond to them get exposed to them a great deal. I think our drug trials, this is in Ordinarily Well, I write about this, because we have 10-cent a pill antidepressants that work well. The only people who enter drug trials now are people who don't respond to antidepressants. So we're testing a group that is very hard to treat. It makes the medicines look bad statistically. There also is something called an anti-psychiatry movement, which is just an interesting phenomenon. There's no, anti-nephrology or anti-ophthalmology movement. And this begins with psychoanalysis, with people saying that psychoanalysis values conformity too much, that it categorizes people too strongly, and so on, but rapidly moves into opposition to medication and psychiatric diagnosis. And so that there are all these articles that are debunked, but are kind of zombie science that stay in the public eye, saying that antidepressants are just glorified placebos with side effects. There's a lot written about the difficulties of these medicines, and there are more difficulties when people stay on them for 20 years. So I think if you wrote this book today, you would really be swimming upstream. And as I say, the streams, which are now polluted with Prozac, you'd be swimming upstream in a stream you don't want to be in. That said, and I sort of play a little with what someone who wrote this book today would be doing. And, it would be insisting on the values of these medicines despite this lack of popularity. 30 years ago, these medicines were sort of titillating. They were on the cover of Newsweek. They sort of had the fate of celebrity, sometimes being celebrated and sometimes being criticized. but there was a general sense of wonder about them. I think we've lost our sense of wonder. And if you take the long perspective that since Hippocrates, humans have wanted to have specific medications for melancholy, the fact that we found some in the 1950s and found better tolerated ones, 20 years later, I think remains very remarkable. But let me stop there just because I think there are other people up here who have very interesting things to say, but I think we could say more on those lines as well.
Yeah. Go.
There should be an anti-nephrology. I'm in favor of authentic kidneys, no, adulterated kidneys with treatment. No, I mean, I'll just say that, like, in some way, I still remember I was showing, before we came out here, I was showing Peter my original marked up, galley copy of Listening to Prozac from 1993. And I'm, in some ways, was an ideal reader because, at an intellectual level, I've always been interested in psychology and Freud and the nature of the self and different modalities of treatment. More personally and emotionally, I had, at that point, I was in my early 20s, been through years of psychotherapy and suffered depression, anxiety, you name it, and had been through a whole panoply of sort of the drugs of the era, starting in the early 80s, from Thorazine and imipramine and Valium, to, at the time I read this, I was actually unmedicated, I think. Maybe I was on dizipramine, which would have been my second a time on a tricyclic. And I was sort of fascinated and terrified by what, Peter had to say about these patients of his who had these transformative experiences where they felt like not only was their depression, cured or went into remission, but also that he would sort of observe these transformations in personality. And on the one hand, I recoiled because it was like, well, wait a minute, what is, who am I? What is the nature of the self? This is the other reason that I was so fascinated by this and remain fascinated by these questions today. If these drugs, a lot of what Prozac and the generation of SSRI medications sort of brought to the fore were these questions about what is the essence of the self, what is the essence of psychopathology, and the relationship between, is to the extent if I am suffering from pathological anxiety or depression, is there a neural correlate of that, a biological substrate that is equivalent to what a diabetic has in terms of malfunctioning of the pancreas or something like that, or and I think the short answer is yes, but at the same time, this is me and who I am, and I like to think that there is something individual and within my, it gets into the matter of free will, and so at that level, I sort of recoiled. I was like, that sounds terrifying. I don't want to give up myself. And this, Peter talks in the book. I don't think this was your coinage. Peter coined cosmetic psychopharmacology, but there was a longer one going back, pharmacological Calvinism, which I think I naturally gravitated to, which is like, no, suffering is good. You grow through suffering. You need to be your authentic self. On the other hand, I was drawn to this powerfully because the case studies, which he wrote so very well, were people who, in some of them, sounded very much like me, and they would start taking the drug, and they would just get better and happier and better than well, as he talks about. And so I had this complex reaction to it, and it was not long after that, I think, in some way influenced by having read Peter's book, that I sort of succumbed to the ongoing entreaties of my then psychiatrist to go on to an SSRI. It was not, as it happened, Prozac, but it was a comparable drug, and it worked. And so I think that the questions that Peter posed in 1993, even though there has been, the growth of the anti-psychiatry movement, which has gotten energy from, what happened with Purdue and opioid addiction and all that, these questions about, how can we use psychopharmacology to aid psychotherapy in ways that get people who are stuck in depression or anxiety to a better place. And there's all kinds of questions which he talks about both in the original book and in the new introduction and new appendix to the revised edition about, how has our scientific understanding about how these drugs work and what the costs and benefits may or may not be. But I feel like there is something to me that was appealing at a personal level in thinking about how can I make myself feel better, and also at an intellectual level of how do I think about this and what is the nature of the self interacting with these, in this case, kind of chemical interventions. But as Peter talks about in the new edition, same thing could be said about how we interact with technology today. This also affects the self. So anyway, I don't know if that was entirely coherent, but the book had a profound impact on me, and I to this day remember elements of it. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, he quoted, Walker Percy was always a novelist who I read and admired, and he cited The Thanatos Syndrome, which at that time was a fairly recent novel, which is a book that talks about, gets to the heart of some of these questions. And in The Thanatos Syndrome, these sort of well-meaning, but possibly sinister, well, definitely sinister, sort of town elders introduce this drug called heavy sodium into the water supply to make people better and women more sexually compliant and people happier. And in some ways it's a utopia, and in some ways it's a dystopia. And this is something that's sort of echoing around the margins of the questions that we had about Prozac and its ilk when they were introduced in the 80s and 90s. So,
Please, just talk amongst yourselves.
Well, I've been moving all over the place in my brain since Peter started talking, and I had a few thoughts. One of them is I actually, in my own memoir, use Bill Styron's memoir as an example of what is not a reflective book about depression. I called it the male narrative of depression, in which depression comes out of nowhere, like Chicken Little falling from the sky. And I don't think, I know Rose Styron well. I just reviewed her book about her life. And she said to me once when we were talking on Martha's Vineyard, but how did you think of going into therapy? And I thought to myself, how did you think of not putting him into therapy? In some ways, to me, Styron is the very intelligent apotheosis, if that's the right word, in the ever-going nature-nurture debate that's behind some of these questions about medication and psychotherapy. To me, he stands for an inability to deal with the environmental aspect of his depression. And by the way, after he was depressed and got better, he had many, many more depressions that got ever worse. And I don't think Rose Styron describes very funnily, wittily, but dismissively the therapists he goes to. So I think in some ways his memoir, while it's always taken as sort of breakthrough, stuck to the side of, cleaved to the notion of depression as biochemical. And I think that's a dangerous notion, actually. The Times asked me some years ago, Sarah Silverman, the comedian, apparently said on one of the morning talk shows, which I myself never watch, that she didn't want to get have a child because she didn't want to pass on depression. So I wrote a piece called Is Depression Inheritable? And I still think, and I said, you know, it's about 50%. I think schizophrenia is a little more. But you don't suddenly get depression. It's environment. I once said I was put on every medication very early, but I was put on Prozac before it was FDA approved. Should have invested in the stock. And I said to my then therapist, but how can you medicate a bad childhood? And he said some good answer about you can't talk to an ulcer. You need first to have the ulcer cured, and then you can talk about it. But I had a terrible experience with Prozac. I think I was put on much too much. And then I couldn't sleep, and I was put on a sleeping pill called Deseril. And the combination, I ended up with urinary retention that went on for 3 months. But I think so I'll never know if Prozac would have changed my character. I did just speak to a psychopharmacologist, actually my own, who said he didn't think this character change happened with people with deep depression, that it more happened with low-grade depression. But I think there is a big distinction between clinical depression and, for lack of a better word, your more walk-a-day depression. That all said, I also read Peter's book when it came out, and I found my edition filled with, I always think I'm utterly unreverential about books, much as I love them. So it's full of turned down pages and check marks, and I do think it was a very revelatory book for many, many people about the whole issue, the cosmetic psychopharmacology part of it. I don't know, I wrote a piece about depression in which I said, has anyone ever seen change? What does change look like? But I was speaking more of I think, again, profound depression, in which I think the medication can bring you out of the depression. Peter may have different experience, but doesn't bring you to, or at least it hasn't for me, to suddenly being a better version of yourself or more outgoing version of yourself. I don't know if that has to do with a hierarchy of depression. I don't know what Peter thinks about that. But coming back to the book, I think it made people think. I still think depression is a fairly, although Prozac made it more fashionable, I still think depression is stigmatized. As recently as this morning, I have a very bad shoulder, which is about to be replaced, and I took a driver from New York to DC, who a friend recommended. And I said to my friend about the driver, I didn't know he suffered from depression and was in fact in a hospital. And she said to me, he told you that right away? And I thought, basically, this is my impression, and you can both have different impressions, obviously. The culture remains unsophisticated about depression. I still think there's a lot of, because depression is on a continuum, many people think, oh, I don't feel good, but I pull my bootstraps up every morning. I think there's still a lot of that in the culture. I think there's still a lot. I mean, I worked at the New Yorker and the Times, supposedly sophisticated places. By the time, maybe, I know the New Yorker was once more welcoming to, what should we call it, mental illness or disturbed writers. But by the time I was there, they were not. They famously had an insurance, I think it was Chubb, that covered frequent therapy sessions. But I remember being very self-conscious about experiencing depression. And I wrote a piece in the New Yorker called, it wasn't called Crazy, it must have been called something, about being in a psychiatric hospital. And that to me still felt more taboo than a piece Scott just mentioned to me, which I wrote for the New Yorker about erotic spanking, which had such a response that I fled for Israel. But saying that I had been in a psychiatric hospital and also walking the halls of the New Yorker, I felt like exposed in a way very little else had that similar effect. I was also just going to say that Peter's very thoughtful forward and afterward, introduction and afterward, mentioned, which I think is sadly true, that there hasn't been an enormous advance in the last, I don't know how many years.
60, right?
Except that I know, I'm only speaking from personal experience, that the use of the small dosage of antipsychotics like Abilify, they're considered facilitating of antidepressants in very small doses. And if anything has helped me, also helped me put on 40 pounds, which is why most people don't sit on Abilify, I would say that combination, which is relatively new or relatively newly used, has had an effect. But once again, I think Peter's book brings up questions, including with cosmetic psychopharmacology, which Scott also mentioned, like what is the authentic self, which I think we all remain fascinated by. You know, is the authentic self a gloomy, especially I think for writer types, because one of my favorite quotes is by a French writer named Robert de Montalent from a novel called The Girls. And I always tell this to writing classes, in which he said, happiness writes white. It doesn't come out on the page. How easy is it to make happiness interesting? And I would link that back to, I think people read partly to see, are they as miserable as I am? These characters, these families, this may all in itself be a very dark rendition of all these issues. But for me, the prevailing issue is the nature-nurture debate. I always have a feeling people can't accept that it's both. And one thing I do think the arrival of Prozac did was relieved people of the burden of introspection, maybe not the way Peter did it, which is with psychotherapy, but kind of made it seem like, oh, I have these internal problems. but they're relieved by this medication. Thus, the internal problems don't have any precedent in my experience. That, to me, was one of the problems with the popularization of Prozac, which those cartoons sort of allude to.
Oh, I was very gratified by cartoons. The year that Listening to Prozac came out, and the following year, the New Yorker ran 3 or 4 Prozac cartoons, not the ones you've seen, including Roz Chast and some other well-known cartoonists. And there had been none before Listening to Prozac. They weren't really Prozac cartoons in my mind. They were Listening to Prozac cartoons. They were about that. They were about that discussion.
There was the great Luc Manon did a back page thing called "Listening to Bourbon,"
Listening to Bourbon,
which was a
right.
great sort
and
of.
one of the cartoons had been a multi-part that ended with listening to Tic Tacs. So it was, so I actually want to pick up something that Daphne said about William Styron and about her own depression. I think depression is hard to write about because people's experience of it is so particular that they always feel you haven't captured theirs. I was in correspondence a little bit with Elizabeth Wurtzel when she was writing Prozac Nation. And so Bill Styron had written about sort of an old alcoholic man's depression. And she wrote about a sexually promiscuous young woman's depression. And they looked, whether depression is really her diagnosis, she also wrote about other diagnoses she might have had. But, the depression is multiple in that way, even though, there may well be a biological bottleneck where, however you got it, there's certain things going on that are in common, across people. And I thought what was valuable about Styron's book was that and if you look at it again, hearing this, I guarantee you'll see that this is so. He wrote about depression being ineffable, how it was really hard to describe, and how throughout literary history, people had trouble, people who otherwise were terrific at describing things, had trouble putting depression into words. And I think that theme emphasized how much worse it is than ordinary unhappiness, which is kind of the theme of all literature, also as Daphne said. I want to say...
Can I interrupt and say one thing? Again, you said something about depression is different for everyone. And Elizabeth Wurtzel was a close friend, so I certainly saw her version. But you could say all experience that's written about is singular. Yeah. So are love affairs. Yeah. No one experiences it the exact same way. And I do think you're right that Styron described the look and feel of depression. I'm talking about the genesis, the etiology of his depression.
No, he didn't like psychiatry at all. He didn't like medication or psychotherapy, and it was... Anyway, Styron aside, in my Pierre Menard analogy, my relief on rereading this book, which I did, kind of inch by inch to when I reapproached it lately, was that almost everything in it holds up, that although you wouldn't write it today, it's not because anything is false. It's because there's been further progress on certain fronts, or because certain things which are said tentatively have turned out to be very much backed up by subsequent research. I think I want to say a little bit about what our current model is of antidepressant action, because I think that's something that has changed. I have these 3 books, Listening to Prozac, Against Depression, Ordinarily Well, which sort of decade by decade update the theory of what depression is altogether, and certainly what antidepressants are doing. And some researchers in England, before some of the research I'm going to mention, started saying that they think that what goes on with antidepressants is they change people's perspective on themselves and the world initially, and that people then elaborate that change because they're able to have this slightly different perspective. They act differently in the world. They start entertaining more generous hypotheses about the self. They're able to build on it. So that the medicines, in effect, are catalyzing some mix of things that we normally would categorize as medication effects and things that we think about more as psychotherapy effects, although they're also, daily life effects. And without getting into some fairly complex material, which is in this afterword, it may be that antidepressants are actually chemically doing two things. One is that by one mechanism, they're combating depression, and the other, via serotonin and some of the things I wrote about in listening to Prozac, they're making people less subject to neuroticism. Neuroticism is a term of art, but it has to do with gloominess, negative self-attributions, some fragility and tendency to fall apart in the face of challenges. And that what may have been useful about these particular antidepressants is that they were sort of at once changing your perspective through serotonin and giving you some relief from depression, so that as you became less depressed, more flexible, better able to learn, you were doing it in the context of this more favorable self-regard and prediction about the world and so on.
You used the word resilience,
Yes.
which I, once again,
Yeah.
had not trouble with, but
You're against it.
I'm against resilience. My next
good
book is
title,
called
yeah.
Against Resilience. Again, I went to a extremely smart psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, who said to me, if we could figure out who is resilient and why, we'd bottle it. And I was also thinking, how could a drug, resilience starts young. You have the resilient child. Does someone become resilient at age 30?
So I have an answer, kind of a
Yes.
term of art answer for this,
Yeah.
but I don't mean for it to be decisive in any way. It'll sound decisive, but it's not, because you're right. But so there's, if you are a child and for some reason one of your eyes isn't working well, or you have to have your eye patched for a ophthalmic condition, the brain will stop recognizing that eye. And when the patch is taken off, you may be what's called amblyopic. Your brain may really recognize one eye much more than the other, so you won't have the binocular vision that we have by having two eyes both look at something at the same time and triangulating. And that ability to have binocular vision occurs at a critical moment in childhood. So there's a period in child development where you get it, and if your eye were patched after that period, it wouldn't bother your brain nearly as much. And this model is very well worked out in rodents, mice and rats. And it turns out that if you take an adult rodent and give it Prozac and patch the working eye, so the non-working eye has to do more, that the mouse or rat is in this juvenile condition. The brain is in this juvenile condition, and the mouse or rat is able to get binocular vision again and get amblyopia. And it's really all of them, you know what I mean? It's not just some of them. In humans, this is less well worked out, and the experiments don't work as well, and because of human experimentation requirements, they have to do some good things for the people who are not on the Prozac. And anyway, about half of the people do get this effect. And so that sort of is the model of resilience, or whatever it is, that the brain really is unstuck in a certain way and has a new, radically new capacity for learning.
I thought that example you gave of the mice was very strong.
Yeah. But I mean, honestly, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'd spent my career, 40 years, doing psychotherapy, and we deal a lot with people who had terrible things happen to
Yes.
them in childhood and what that predisposes them to in terms of their, responses to current circumstance. But in a way, that is the purpose of medication and psychotherapy, is decoupling those events. I mean, even psychotherapy is really trying to get you not
Right.
to see
True.
your wife as
this
your
isn't-
mother,
yes.
and so on.
But looking back at the book, I was reminded that one of the fascinating things is that you sort of identify that, one of the theories for how Prozac and its ilk work, I mean, it treats depression, but maybe independent, not by going directly at the depression, but you said this earlier, by sort of alleviating personality traits or changing personality traits having to do with neuroticism and things, and that via that transformation, it makes it easier, maybe in the context of also talk therapy, to relieve depression. And that's fascinating in and of itself, that these are not drugs that necessarily go straight at depression, whatever that means, but go at other things. But that's, again, they're changing personality. They're changing personality traits as opposed to just mood. And that's where I think that this dichotomy or dialectic between pharmacological Calvinism and cosmetic psychopharmacology, like on the one hand, it's like, here are these drugs that can make that can change your personality and make you better than well, and make you more assertive and more confident and more effective at work, and incidentally make you less depressed. So they're getting at the heart of it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and this gets to notions of how we think about who we are and why the way we are, they are changing things that seem core to who we are, and it kind of if whether I am optimistic or pessimistic is a matter of tweaking molecules or neurotransmitters in my brain. What does that mean about the nature of my essence? And those to me were the interesting philosophical questions, and obviously they then bared very directly on how you treat depression.
No, this is exactly right. I mean, I think there's a case for wanting, and I think Daphne is saying this, to play the hand you're dealt. And that if your experience in childhood is that, people can be cruel and arbitrary and everything can be taken away, shouldn't you want to face, shouldn't you represent that perspective in the world, since it certainly is a true perspective, and not everybody's. And, so I think that's one side of it. And then, the other side that I had just observing my patients was this patient who said to me, "On this medication, I'm myself at last." And that's one of the core sort of themes in the book, is what could that mean? If this medicine had never been invented, would this woman never have been herself? And what is it not to be yourself? Is she actually more herself post or pre or post? But I'm very sympathetic, and I, with the notion that maybe we ought to want to have the consequences. I suppose the reason psychiatrists don't like depression, besides all the kind of medical model reasons, which is that it interferes with your heart and blood elements and bone and brain and glandular hormones, and it's sort of a bad multi-system disease, is that people really get stuck in it. So it's not that people are deeply depressed and they're thinking well about early childhood experiences. They're deeply depressed and they're thinking in circles, and they can't have a fresh or original thought. So I think that is sort of the case for unsticking the switch.
Yes.
Well, I mean, you have a great line, and I'm going to misquote it. Maybe you said a version of it earlier, but it's like, am I medicating my childhood, or am I medicating, my serotonin, my neurotransmitters? And you could say the same thing about, again, the pancreas, like, which can be related to psychosocial factors as well. Am I and maybe it shouldn't matter. I get hung up on this because it's like, wait, I'm me, and I'm scared by the notion that tweaking molecules changes the essence of who I am. At the same time, I also am debilitated at times by depression and anxiety, and I would do anything to relieve them. And if something could come in and sweep that away, but that's the question. Like, what are you medicating? The underlying neurobiological correlate or physiological substrate, and this is where the psychotherapy that you do is so interesting, because how do you combine that with talking about the content of the thoughts or the distorted conceptions, in the way that like Freud or anyone doing psychodynamic talk therapy since then might have done?
I think the problem with depression is that the ailment and the human response to it are so intimately intertwined, so that if you have terrible cancer and you are in despair over it, I think no one would say, well, don't take away the cancer. They might say the despair is sort of appropriate, and maybe you ought to write about that, and maybe if you recover from it. Elizabeth Benedict has a wonderful new book about that's poetic and little pieces about her cancer, which luckily was a curable cancer, but it's about the world's and her response to this ailment. Well, I think with depression, it's harder to cut those two apart, because if you treat the depression, you will experience the world differently.
Yeah. I have one question about something you wrote about in the afterward, when you go more into the science, which is, I just want to ask you historically, the notion that of the plasticity of the brain and that new cells can spring up. First of all, it made me happy, excited, like, oh. But secondly, I wondered, isn't that fairly new? And I thought of a book I love that I thought was a brilliant account called Genie, Genie, about a girl who was kept in a basement, and she was, very abused. And they ultimately used her to see when the window closed on acquiring language skills. They tried to get her to talk. And they decided, I believe, that the window closed around age 6 or 7, which made me think, how then would there be, in a certain way, to talk about the plasticity of the brain is like the window is always open.
Yes, so this is between listening to Prozac and against depression.
Yeah.
Somebody discovered using terminal cancer patients, where you could do these experiments, that human beings' brains make new cells all the way into old age, and it was really thought not to be true. There were examples in primates of these cells, but it was thought that in humans, with our complex brain, language, and so on, we were not making new cells. So this is sort of, I'm going to get this wrong, but 1990s science, quite recent. But of course, once that happened, people looked for it everywhere. And in particular, they were looking for it in depression and with these antidepressants. So it's maybe not the whole brain, and maybe there are relevant parts of the brain where it's not happening, but certainly, yes.
Oh, I was just going to say I was going to go to questions after you finish.
That's it.
You're done. Okay. Audience, any questions? I have more, but yes.
So you said, sure. Daphne said that we haven't made much progress, and I was just curious if you've thought about this. I read quite a bit about experimenting with psychedelics and mushrooms and all that, and it seems like a whole new world, and I'm just curious how that fits into this.
Well, Peter refers to it again in his after. I myself, as usual, trying everything. Some years ago, I was taken out by a PR guy to lunch, I remember, at the Four Seasons with this very glossy doctor who was opening ketamine centers. I tried ketamine, as one of my sisters did. She had more of the reaction you referred to of sort of displacement, sort of negative, like a bad trip. I simply, session after session, fell asleep. And my psychologist said to me, in fact, I was thinking of suggesting it as a piece, said to me that he thought ketamine was basically a scam. I don't know if that's too harsh. I know from my own experience, I didn't quite, maybe months later, in fact, it worked. That's all, and the psychedelic, the psilocybin, I think they just had an article about ecstasy. I will just say the time I tried ecstasy in my grandeur years, and it was the only time in my life I thought there's nothing wrong with me. I will go on to write books. So it did have this very strong effect of an antidepressant effect. And maybe there is a lot of room for all that.
Don't underestimate the therapeutic value of a nap.
True, true.
So, my books and writing are really based on intimate clinical experience, and I have not had experience with psychedelics or ketamine. I stopped seeing patients almost 5 years ago, and just as practicing doctors started giving ketamine injections or infusions, depending what they were doing. And I think there's going to be a role for them. I have colleagues who have some patients do very well on ketamine. There's also some other classes of drugs. I think if we have this meeting again in 10 years, we won't say there are no substantive alternatives to the current antidepressants. There will be. There's a drug related to hormones that change during pregnancy in women, or pregnant people, as we say. And they originally were given by 36-hour infusion for postpartum depression and seemed quite effective. And they seem to last for quite a while. Of course, in the case of postpartum depression, it's urgent that the mother be able to relate to her child right away. And so that's a fantastic result. These seem to last maybe 6 or 9 months before you need another treatment. And they've recently come out in pill form or been approved by the FDA. I don't know.
Oxytocin, or what's the?
No. It's one of the female sex hormones, and I'm going to block that up. But it's like estradiol, and it's going to be fabulously expensive. But you'll take it for in pill form for 2 weeks, and then they expect again you'll do well maybe for 6 to 9 months, and that'll answer I think a lot of questions about drug withdrawal and so on, because there's no withdrawal from these. You're just done, and we'll sort of see how people do over time. I want to just mention a funny experiment that has to do with ketamine. It's not dispositive, but it just amused me because it was so clever. So ketamine is an anesthetic. It was introduced as an anesthetic long before anyone thought of using it for depression. And I don't want to undercut it too much because there are really good experiments using it in psychotic depression, which we haven't discussed, another terrible condition. And people who don't respond to anything else sometimes respond to ketamine. But
It was a horse tranquilizer.
It was a horse tranquilizer. So this is the experiment. You have depressed people, and they have something that needs surgery. So they have a terrible leg fracture at a level where they need general anesthesia. And half of them you just give your regular anesthesia, as you would. Half of them you give ketamine in the lower dose that is used to treat depression. and you fill out the rest of their needs with conventional antidepressant. So half of these people have gotten antidepressant level of ketamine, and half haven't. And you do the surgery, and some do well, some do poorly in both groups. And at the end, the groups look identical. Taking ketamine doesn't seem to have any more antidepressant effect. Either it doesn't have an antidepressant effect, or the other anesthetics also have an antidepressant effect, which is not outside the realm of possibility, I say parenthetically. But but the patients in general did seem to do somewhat better, even though they were equal. They weren't as depressed as they had been going into the surgery. Now maybe they were in pain or whatever. But I just thought that is a very funny experiment, and enough to make us a little skeptical about what's going on, since these are not really drugs where you can do double-blind trials. Patients know if they're on ketamine or not. They're not blind to it.
So Peter, I don't want to put words into your mouth, so correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this. But when you talk about the change in how people see themselves on Prozac, that specific piece of it, you're using language that makes it sound like it makes them see themselves more truthfully. I think you actually used the word truth twice in talking about it. Not that it's an enhancement, not that we're trying to make them, this is the goal, that everyone needs to see themselves this well, or at this, in this way, but that it's kind of taking away something that's blocking them from seeing themselves accurately. Am I overstating that?
Yes. I apologize for the word truth. I don't know where it came from, or it. I mean, in these sort of British experiments, Philip Cowan is one of the people, one of the authors usually. Catherine Hamer, that people looking at images, have more positive response to faces, or more positive responses to their own face. So it's definitely in a direction of upbeat. It's not, I don't know about truth or authenticity, but more generally, when you look at personality traits in depressed people, this is sort of the better than well phenomenon, that the movement is from aberrant and largely socially dysfunctional traits to more normative levels and more socially functional levels. So yes, I mean, people probably are less self-critical and less self-demeaning and able. And so there was a ketamine experiment along these lines also, which I think was interesting and pulls together the antidepressant and psychotherapy aspects of this, that when people were given ketamine and then they were shown pictures of themselves in conjunction, it's probably on a computer, with positive attributions and positive statements about themselves, and there were some other stimuli on the upbeat direction, as opposed to people given more random photos or more random comments in association with their own pictures. And the antidepressant effects of ketamine work better in the first group. So, that's one of these sort of critical period, combined with, some primitive effort at cheerleading or psychotherapy. But yes.
Isn't there also this phenomenon that you talk about called, and I don't know how well supported or how well regarded the literature on this is, but depressive realism, that depressed people sometimes, as maladaptive as this may be, have a more accurate perception of certain things. And does that mean that getting them via, Prozac to a higher level of functioning means providing them with a level of adaptive delusion that makes them more functional?
So I wish I remember this better, but in Against Depression, I actually discussed that literature. And, kind of experiments I remember is that people are given cards and they're, could win or lose, and that the depressed, people who are not depressed are overly optimistic, and people who are depressed are less optimistic. But in a broader range of experiments, it just isn't true that depressed people are more accurate. They're inaccurate.
I think I remember.
And in particular, they're inaccurate about their own prospects. I mean, which is a bad thing to be inaccurate about.
Yeah.
And by the way, people who are depressed can make tremendous contributions to the corporation they work in and be enormously valuable. And, this is a whole other discussion about sort of accommodation in the workplace. But I would say the literature on the whole doesn't say that depressed people are very accurate. And in those card experiments, it's sort of stacked because the only accuracy is less. So of course, depressed people are going to be less. So it's sort of a, I guess if they got enough less so that they were, further off on the downside than non-depressed people are on the upside, that would be remarkable. But they're not, I do hear this all the time. I'm not sure it's right.
Right, and then maybe in my memoir, I make this stalwart statement that depression is the loss of delusions, which isn't the same as saying depressive reality. But I think to function well in the world, people function partly on delusions about themselves. I don't know if that's different than depressive, or that is a version of depressive realism. I mean, the people I know who are most functioning and happy, maybe this is all, I seem to have endlessly dark examples, seem not so realistic about themselves from my point of view.
No, I know you want to shake them and say, wake up.
Or it's a blunting of what you this phenomenon of rejection sensitivity.
Yes.
Like maybe being overly attuned to rejection or
You're right.
setbacks is non-productive and pathological, and yet being inured to it is delusional and yet helpfully so.
Yes,
Right.
no, I think this is really right. That when I wrote about rejection sensitivity, which is people who kind of go off a cliff when they get a little disappointment or insult. And I think those people are, from a psychiatric point of view, overly sensitive, in that you don't want to go off a cliff every time your, significant other turns his or her back. But that maybe they're accurate. Maybe the sensitivity also includes a really good attunement to subtle slights and insults that people shouldn't get away with. And, I think
Right.
that's right.
Right.
And my patients were very good at that.
Right.
I guess I'll ask one of the last questions then. I work with people who have drug problems, and I'm a big believer in the self-medication model of addiction. And in a way, they're trying to do what you talk about. People who drink, at least in the early phases of their drinking career, where that finally does make them feel normal, or their inhibitions, social inhibitions drop away, and opioids are especially good at being kind of oblivions as opposed to euphoriants and depressants, because they make people just not care that much. And unfortunately, I think these things are so reinforcing, they're so pleasurable, that you can't often maintain those benefits from them. But it just reminds me a lot of what you're talking about.
So, opium really was one of the earliest antidepressants before there were what we think of as drugs that are more specifically directed at depression, the syndrome. And I think it's right that you would, if these drugs in addition weren't addictive and didn't require higher doses and weren't lethal in overdose, you would be out of business, because just the immediate effect is certainly something that people value.
Yeah, and you know what? There's a whole genre of people who use opioids. They're called chippers, Do you remember that phrase?
Yeah.
And there are people who can handle their opioids because their tolerance doesn't increase very much, and they have access to it. And so they just use it the way, the way, frankly, people might, frankly, use anything. If they have access to it, you can use it during the day, usually need it every 3 to 4 hours, and maintain a steady blood level. Don't use enough to nod out. And it's just modulates their whole, mood and arousal state, and it works very well. But it's very susceptible to disruptions. Like if your dealer, leaves town or gets arrested, or it gets more expensive, But we don't study them because they don't come in for help.
Right.
I was going to say, what differentiates them from the people who tip over into sort of full-on
Well, they
abject
can
addiction?
tip over. I remember had a patient once who used heroin with really no problem for quite a while because he got it from his girlfriend, but when she dumped him, and then he actually it was not, her dumping him wasn't so much the supply because he'd get it from someone else, but just the loss and the distress. That tipped him over into an addictive user.
And then the tolerance problem.
But I'm always amazed it's
It's
not used
yes.
more. Once when I was deeply, deeply depressed, had been in a hospital. I sound like I spent my life in psychiatric hospitals. I went to see an old psychiatrist of mine, and he said, "Do not tell anyone this." And he gave me four OxyContin and said, "Take 2, and then 12 hours later, take 2 more." And within taking it, I rose from my bed. I think I went out and got strawberries and had a manicure, very accomplished
yes.
feats. And then I took the other 2 hours later, and I began to come out of my depression. And I said, why can't this be used in a more regulated? I mean, not everyone is prone to addiction, even with these addictive. And it had this amazing effect.
Although it's a confounded experiment because it could have been the strawberries or the manicure that made you
That's
better.
true, like the nap.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we need another experiment, natural experiment where you don't
Yeah.
get any.
Let's not oversell this, but I mean, I think opioids are a great interest to researchers, and
Yeah.
they really want ones
Yeah,
that
great.
hit some receptors and not others, so they can, maybe
Right.
get these
Get the
positive effects
Positive.
without.
Well, they've been doing that for
Which
over
is-
a century,
there's
looking for
been
that.
a lot
They didn't
of,
call them receptors then, but looking.
Difficult promise, yes.
In fact, heroin by Bayer, which came out in 1898, was supposed to be the cure for morphine because it was addictive. Anyway, on that happy note, thank you all for coming, and thank you for a great discussion.